talking about asymmetrical attacks and the role this plays in physical security with CAT Chief Instructor Brian Harris. So, Brian, what exactly is an asymmetrical attack and why is this relevant to physical security?
So, asymmetry or asymmetrical attacks are, well, first off, there's a difference between asymmetric attacks and asymmetric vulnerabilities, but just asymmetric attack is, as an attacker, whether you're a simulating attacker or if you're a real bad guy, what types of attacks can you leverage that maximize the damage or effectiveness of your attack with minimal risk and effort on your part? So think of this in the sense of, is there something that I can do as a bad guy or a simulated bad guy that will require very little effort, very little risk, very little compromise on my part, but will maximally devastate, destroy, or accomplish the goal that I'm setting out to do?
So, I can see some reasons why it would be relevant to physical security, but can you talk a little bit about its relevance in that regard?
Yeah, so when you're talking about asymmetric attacks in the physical security space, really any security space, what you're looking at here is there an adversary out there who can completely compromise what this defenses that you set up with very little effort and very little risk to them? So some examples might be, the substation attack, which we talked about before, where you've had, I think the Department of Energy estimates that there's around 200 attacks on any given year on the U.S. power grid, either through the internet or through physical damage. And there was attack in, there's been a lot of attacks such as this, but there was one in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where somebody found the substation that was powering the entire base and the surrounding area. They stood off at a few hundred meters. They shot at it in just the right spot. They damaged the substation such that it had to be taken offline. And as far as I know, the person who did this was never caught. So here you had Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So you've got the largest U.S. military installation in North America. You've got, home of the airborne, the special forces, JSOC, Special Operations Command. You've got all these really important things at one military installation, and one person with a gun was able to stand off at distance, fire a few rounds, and take power out to that facility. Now, it only took power out for a few days because luckily they didn't continue what they were doing and they didn't quite shoot the right spots, which I'm not going to go into what those are. But had they have done this, well, then, regardless, an emergency mobile substation had to become taking the load off, etc. But now look at, kind of what we're dealing with here. You've got one guy with a gun, easy to get in the United States. It's easy to get anywhere. But one guy with a gun stands off a distance, fires gun at a specific spot. There's very little risk because there's not much security in the middle of nowhere, 300 meters away from a substation. The response time from law enforcement is going to be quite long because, again, you're in the middle of nowhere. And there's going to be a delay between when the guy's shooting to when the power company realizes there's a pressure differential or drop, there's heating, overheating, etc. So there's going to be this long latency between when the emergency responders are notified of what's going on and they actually show up on station. So again, very little effort, very little risk, maximum damage.
And I feel like I see an example in terms of a storefront, for example. If you have no cameras, if you have no alarms, if your merchandise isn't tagged with ink tags or sensors or things that might set off when people steal them, or if criminals can get away with any crime up to $500. Basically, all of these are ways that you make crime asymmetric in the physical space.
Sort of. So asymmetric, So it is as the risk goes down and the effort required to pull it off goes down, and the benefit to you goes up. So you could argue that in California, for instance, where they've effectively legalized petty crime, you could argue that petty crime has now become asymmetric, and as a result, you see, what's the consequence of this is lots of businesses are shutting down because they can't afford to continue to have millions of dollars or billions of dollars of merchandise stolen.
So we kind of see some examples here. We have the infrastructure example you gave. We've got the consumer example that we were just discussing. Do you have any examples from like a corporate perspective?
Yeah. So all right. So I'll give you an example. I've pulled this trick many times over the last 18 years. This I use this as an example to demonstrate to clients, but hopefully you can see how vulnerable this makes people. When you're thinking asymmetrically, just think again, what is the minimal risk to you as the adversary with the maximum damage? Well, oftentimes what clients are interested in is they want to scare the board of directors or the people who carry the purse strings to increase the budget for physical or cybersecurity or what have you. And so your job often is try to breach them, try to do something that's scary to the board of directors. And one of the tricks that you can do that's fairly easy, and hopefully you'll see why this is an example of asymmetry, is suppose that the client that you're dealing with allows for meetings to be set up, which is very common. So whether it's a consultancy business or a bank or a pension company or whomever, that company will be doing business with other companies, right? That's just kind of how business works. If you can pretend to be or are legitimately another company that they are willing or interested in doing business with, set up a meeting at their facility. Set up a meeting at their facility, and then when you are at that meeting, bug the meeting room. Because think of it this way. What meetings take place in that meeting room? Well, there's almost assuredly, if that's the meeting that the client has said, hi client, this is the meeting room that we will be in, then chances are other clients will be in that meeting room, potentially your competitors or potentially other investors or whatever. But on top of that, that may be the meeting room that they have internal meetings on. You don't know. But there's going to be a lot of meetings that are held in that meeting room. There's no risk and there's nothing illegal or illicit or eyebrow raising about setting up a meeting with a company that authorizes such things to talk about business. That's perfectly legal. That's perfectly normal behavior. So if while you're in that meeting, you find a way to bug that meeting room, say, you have one of your colleagues kind of distract the guy, or maybe one of your colleagues ask, oh, hey, could you show me where, the bathroom is or this or that, or maybe as you're leaving the room, you say, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot my bag. One of your employees is distracting the client contact while you go inside and you bug something. It doesn't take a lot of effort or thought on how could you accomplish this. But then again, let's suppose for a minute that this client has 10 to 20 meetings a month in that room. And let's say that after 6 to 12 months, the client finds your bug. Maybe they're cleaning, maybe something fell, maybe, whatever. 6 to 12 months later, with about 20 meetings per month, they're going to have no idea, as long as you were smart, who planted that device. All they know is we found a bug or bugs in this meeting room. We don't know how long it's been here. We don't know who put it here. We don't know what they got. We don't know why. We just know it's here. And then you think as the adversary, well, okay, what did I accomplish? Well, I definitely scared the client. Definitely, I could have listened to anything that they wanted. I could have, published it. If they were talking about business strategies, if they were having confidential meetings about, where they are as a company, if they're talking about strategies for next year, whatever, it doesn't matter. I can sell those secrets. I can publish them to the world. Like this is how a lot of this goes down. So again, what did that take for you? Setting up a meeting. Well, that's not hard. And then having a bug that you can do, and then planting a bug when one guy or a couple are not paying attention, that's also not difficult to do. So very little risk to you. And in this potential instance, you get a lot of benefit from it. Now, that's not the worst thing you can do. That's not planting a bash bunny on the server rack. That's not, getting access to the archives. There are worse things you can do to a company. This is an example of an asymmetric attack where it requires very little effort, very little risk, and it accomplishes what you set out to do with almost no risk to you. So that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, I understand. Is there any equivalent to this asymmetrical attack in the cyberspace?
Yeah, so anybody who's ever trying to do pen testing in the cyber world, you've come across SQL injections and IDOR attacks and cross-site scripting attacks and all this kind of stuff. The equivalent of this would probably be if you were operating on the Tor network, which means that it's still possible that you can, make stupid mistakes and get caught, sure, but the likelihood of you getting caught is pretty minimal, especially if you're not otherwise on the FBI, the NSA, or somebody's web or somebody's radar. and you find a website or a web page and you just type in, the classic double quotes or 1 = 1 semicolon kind of thing, and you dump the entire database, right? And then once you've dumped the database, maybe you can do other things. You could drop the tables, whatever you want to do. But the point is that that's a very little risk to you, little effort kind of thing. These types of low-hanging fruits, this is something that it perplexes me how people don't understand this, that just like there are a lot of low-hanging fruits in the cyber world, like that, where you even have tons and tons of tools that'll automate these types of tests for you, all the low-hanging fruit, send out various tools and things to look for these low-hanging fruit. There are the equivalent of that in the physical world. The thing is that what you're looking for is this low-hanging fruit that has cataclysmic or high return on investment. So again, going back to the substation attack, right? Very little effort, very little equipment needed, very little skill, maximal damage. And it's not just think of it this way. It's not just electric. I mean, electric does kind of power everything, literally. But think about water. So again, like when you have water, you have the water treatment facilities, but then you also have the distribution points, like a person's home, but there is things in between. And if you do a little research and you ask, okay, what's protecting, the water pipes in between, it's significantly less than most people think. And if you look at the right websites and you look down in Mexico, there's a thing called hot tapping, where you tap into an active water line to steal water or do other things. And in Mexico, it's estimated that the Mexican cartels or otherwise bad people are stealing between 2 and 3 million gallons of water a day via hot tapping. Well, that's a lot of water loss. 2 to 3 million gallons a day of water loss, and that doesn't change the fact that you could do other things other than just steal the water. But again, it shows that if you can have somebody in a third world country who can do these attacks, dozens of times a day and steal millions of gallons of water, it's not a complicated attack, and they're clearly not getting caught because you're seeing this increase, not decrease.
For someone working in physical security, how do you actually start to think asymmetrically, and how do you use this on your assignments effectively?
Yeah, so, okay. I had a student once, so there was a class that I was teaching a while back, and I had a student who happened to be a CISO. And in the classroom, I probably had about $20,000, $30,000 worth of equipment. And he asked me, there's a lot of really valuable, at the end of the day, he asked me, there's a lot of really valuable stuff in here. What lock would you put on the door to ensure no one could get inside and all your stuff would be safe? And I used that. I love that question because it was a perfect example of how not to think when it comes to adversarial attacking. So, because to him, as a CISO, the way that he's looking at this is, what can I do on the perimeter? What can I do on the defense side to just stop this from happening altogether? And then we used that as a storming session, and we showed that, look, let's suppose that we have, like, just for the sake of argument, let's suppose that we have a lock that no human being on Earth can pick. It's an unpickable lock. And I said, okay, well, let's walk through what we know about the building that we're operating in. And we did a back and forth, and we talked about how there was a cleaning staff, and we talked about how through some social engineering and elicitation, we were able to discover that the cleaning staff kept a bunch of master keys in a cabinet that had a $5 wafer lock on it that every one of the students could pick after minimal training. And so just that alone, now there was several other vectors to breach, but just that alone, you could, hypothetically get a lock that no human being on Earth could pick. Fine, let's say that exists. But then when it's done and you've installed that lock and you've convinced the client to pay an unfathomable amount of money for the unpickable lock, well, okay, but then the janitor has that key in a cabinet across the hall protected by a $5 wafer lock that every single student after, 20 minutes of practice can pick. So the point of that is when you are trying to think asymmetrically, the first thing you need to do is think like an attacker. You have to look through the lens as a bad guy. Look at it and say, okay, well, I was going to break that into that building, but they have a fence. Well, can I get over fences? Can I go around fences? Like, what can I do? It's like, okay, I didn't anticipate there being a security camera here. Can I bypass it? Can I blind it? Can I deauthenticate it? Can I cut the cable? Is there anything that I can do on this? So the first thing to think is think like an attacker. Look through everything and say, if I was a bad guy and I'm looking at the setup they've put in place, how could I bypass it? Is it possible to get around it? Is it possible to do these things? And then, if it is it possible to do it asymmetrically? Can I do it in a way that requires very little risk and effort to me with maximum efficiency?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, because I know for me, lockpicking is my lowest skill set. I suck at lockpicking, but I am much, much better at elicitation or other skills. So for me, picking that wafer lock, well, it still is going to take me enough time that I'm going to draw attention. So,
Right.
It's not always the same for every person.
No, exactly. It's not the same for every person. So this is the difference between asymmetric vulnerabilities, which most people in the hacking space will know as critical vulnerabilities, and asymmetric attacks. An asymmetric vulnerability is kind of what we've been talking about, where this is a vulnerability that, regardless as to who goes after it, it exists, right? The substation is a perfect example. Taking out a substation is not a complicated thing, and if you know what you're doing, it just goes offline. And I'm not going to go into details, but it's not necessary. It is an objective vulnerability. An asymmetric attack is an asymmetric vulnerability that you have the ability to actually exploit. Mm-hmm. So going back to, you said that you suck at lockpicking. Mm-hmm. So let's suppose for a minute that a client has a rear door that happens to go straight to the server room. There's a door that goes in from an alleyway directly into the server room. There's no cameras, there's no alarms, there's no guards. It's just a pin tumbler lock. Great. But let's say that you literally can't pick it. Well, okay, that's definitely an asymmetric kind of vulnerability, but you are incapable of actually exploiting it, so it's not a viable asymmetric attack for you. That doesn't mean it's not an asymmetric attack somebody else can't do. It is a catastrophic vulnerability or an asymmetric vulnerability, but it's not viable for you as a pen tester. It's not viable for you as an attacker to actually exploit. So this goes back to the point of, what is an asymmetric attack will depend on the skill sets and the team and other things of who's going actually about it. So in that example, if you have somebody who is a master lockpicker but completely socially inept, that's still the server room with a pin tumbler lock and no other security. That is an asymmetric attack. But if you have somebody who is the most charming Don Juan savvy person in existence, but they can't pick a lock to save their life, no amount of charming the door is going to make it open. So it's not a viable attack in that example. So again, an asymmetric vulnerability is just, anything that's objectively catastrophically vulnerable. Anything that an asymmetric attack is just an asymmetric vulnerability that you can actually take advantage of. Now, a lot of times I wrap those things into one and just say this was an asymmetric attack because it was an asymmetric vulnerability that you did take advantage of or somebody did.
So asymmetric attacks are relative, but asymmetric vulnerabilities are objective. So what are some examples of objective vulnerabilities? It doesn't matter what skills the team has. It's there for the taking.
Well, it always matters what skills you have. That's always an inevitable thing, right? So let's go back to the substation attack. This substation attack, the reason it's an asymmetric vulnerability is because a bad guy can stand off with a high-powered rifle at distance and shoot at the thing in just the right spot. Okay, but what does that require? You have a gun, right? And you know how to use a gun. So if I, for whatever reason, took the gun out of the equation, then suddenly it's still an asymmetric vulnerability. The vulnerability still exists, but you don't have the means or the equipment to actually exploit it. So there are, like, again, the substation thing, the water treatment thing, there are vulnerabilities out there that are always, that just are super vulnerable, but it depends on, do you have the means, equipment, training, methods, skills to actually exploit it? So one vulnerability that I take advantage of often is cleaning staff. So when you're running an engagement, let's say corporate office, bank, whatever, one of the things that I do often is, if you can break into a building in the evening time. So usually the shtick goes like this. You do all of your reconnaissance. You find out that there's a cleaning staff that shows up every night. Let's say that the employees leave the office at 5. And let's say it's 7 o'clock, a third-party cleaning staff who doesn't work for the bank shows up and they enter in through the rear door, some service elevator, some service door, whatever. They come in through the rear at 7 o'clock. The first thing that the cleaning staff will do when they show up after hours is turn off all the alarms. They have to, right? They show up, they come in, they turn off the alarms, and then they go about cleaning. That means that at that time, now let's say that the cleaning staff is there for 1 hour. So for 1 hour, they're moving through the building, cleaning up this, cleaning up that. But that means for that 1 hour, from 7 o'clock until 8 o'clock, that means that the alarms, at least most of them, maybe not all of them, maybe the server room or the archive room, maybe it has their own special alarm system, maybe. But at least the main alarm systems are going to be offline from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and the people who are going to be occupying the building are going to be minimal, and they're definitely not the kinds of people who are going to be caring who's in the building. They just don't. They're third party. They probably don't work for the bank. They have minimal training. They're paid the absolute bare minimum you could possibly pay a human being. All they are there is to clean the toilets and mop the floors. That's all they care about. They're there after hours. They're there late. They just want to do their job and get the hell out. So if you happen to break in at the time when the cleaning staff is there, so say the cleaning staff comes in through the rear and you come in through maybe the top floor, through a window, or maybe you come in through the front, whatever. By the time you meet them in the middle, as long as you are dressing the part and you've printed out a badge that looks good, you're wearing the right lanyard, etc., it's not hard to convince them that you are an employee who's overworked and just there after hours. Well, that's a perfect example of an asymmetric attack, because what does that require of you? Well, not much. You have to breach into the building. Yep. So you need to have a little minimal breaching ability. Sure. You have to know a little bit of recon and that type of thing, because you have to figure this out, which that's not hard to do. But then that's about it. And then, just like the cleaning staff, you are in the building after hours, unsupervised, to do anything you want. Okay, so that is almost always an objectively asymmetric attack vector. But that said, you'd be surprised how often clients will tell you that's out of scope. Which is hilarious, right? Because it's like, okay, so go back to the substation thing. If the energy company said, we want you to point out every single vulnerability that exists, but shooting or physical damage to the substation, even contemplating it, even making the argument for it, is out of scope. Well, okay, then I'm just going to tell you that you're perfectly fine, because if I can't damage the thing, well, most of my attack vectors, or many of my attack vectors, are now offline. So, yes, so you would be surprised how often clients knowingly or unknowingly basically shoot themselves in the foot, because they say, okay, this thing that could catastrophically destroy us with minimal effort and risk on your part, we're not going to consider it.
Yeah, and I know you've used the example in the past of people say like, oh, but we don't think anybody's ever going to do that. And it's sort of like, yeah, but the most successful asymmetrical attacks are things that you don't think anyone's going to do. It's sort of like 9/11 or, examples like that.
Right, so this is a pretty extreme case, but it's a perfect example. It's the reason why the attacker always wins in the end. The reason why every single day you find new vulnerabilities, new CVEs, new breaches, new ransoms, new this, new that, is because two things. One, the bad guys just need to find a single loophole. The good guys have to have a 100% safety record at all times, which is not realistic. It's not something that can ever be done.
Sure. There's
always going to be holes. There's always going to be chinks in the armor. There's always going to be vulnerabilities. They exist. And somebody somewhere will take advantage of it. Somebody will discover it. And two, because the attackers get to think novelly. You get to think crazy out-of-the-box ways. Like that example that I previously referenced about, the Delta Force and the Secret Service kind of like going head-to-head, which is possibly an apocryphalic story, but as the story went, the Delta Force and the Secret Service had a little beef that said, Delta can always breach the White House if they wanted, and there's nothing you can do. So, the Secret Service, they put out, I think it was a week, as the story goes, that, Delta was going to try and breach the White House, and the Secret Service did exactly what you'd expect the defense to do. They doubled the guards at the gate, they double-checked all the people coming in, the vehicles coming in, they put more people on the perimeter, they just doubled down. And Delta, knowing that you can't fly over the White House because it's restrictive airspace, just flew close by, high enough to do a halo jump, where they flew just close enough and free fell into or over the White House in the middle of the night, landed their parachutes basically right next to the front door, and walked inside, right? But the point of that, assuming it's a real story, which may or may not be true, but assuming that story is true, Um, it the Secret Service never had a standard operating procedure that says, oh yeah, by the way, while you're checking people coming in and checking their IDs, make sure that you have somebody looking up into the sky at all hours just to make sure that no one's free fall parachuting over into the White House, right? So you as a bad guy, you as the attacker, you are the reality check for the defense. So the security, 3 parts, right? You have compliance. Compliance just says this is what you need, the tools, the security, the software, etc., to be secure. That's all that is. Defense, which is how is the tools of the compliance actually being used? What are you are you using the tools correctly? And the offense, which is the reality check to both of the previous ones. That is, I'm going to see what you've put in place and I'm going to try and bypass it. I'm going to try and get around it. I'm going to try and find vulnerabilities and we're going to see if this works. So, I mean, you get to think in really crazy, novel ways. And there is the reason why you have so many standard operating procedures nowadays against things like tailgating and lockpicking and this and that is because bad guys either got into it this way or pen testers figured out, oh, hey, that's vulnerable. And so you got to fix it.
So if the bad guy is always going to win eventually, and, you know, in physical security space, you're, or in black teaming, you are simulating the bad guy, how is the blue team supposed to secure against you?
Right. So, okay. So the defense has to do their due diligence, right? That's the first thing. They have to do their due diligence. But the thing is that they need to incorporate 2 things, which oftentimes they don't. One, they need to employ the offense. So security has 3 parts to it: compliance, defense, offense. The problem is that oftentimes the offense takes a back seat, or if it exists at all. And so as a result, you have defense that says, well, we're the best because we've never been breached. But then again, we've never tested our own security. Imagine a basketball team. So the compliance would be you need the shorts, you need the court, you need the ball, like you need this many players. That would be the compliance. The defense would be doing drills against yourselves, right? Well, if that's all you ever do, you never play a real game against another team, how do you know how good you are? You have no way to tell, okay, when the big game comes, are we going to win? We have no idea. We have no record whatsoever. Like, it doesn't exist. We just assume.
Or hell, if you never practice shooting baskets, you only practice defense, literal defense.
Right.
The other team only has to make 1 basket. You have to fail 1 time.
Right, yeah, that's possibly a better example. It's the point is just that if you don't incorporate the offensive security aspect of things, then you really have no idea. You might think I'm doing everything perfectly, and you might even catch a bunch of vulnerabilities. People trying to breach things, people trying to throw phishing campaigns. You might catch these things, and that's awesome, and that's great, and you're doing that part of your job. But that doesn't mean that you would catch when a real bad guy comes in. You could be going, the person who's sending you a phishing campaign might be a 14-year-old idiot from Russia who knows nothing. But when somebody actually savvy comes after you, you could fail catastrophically. You don't know. And you won't know unless you actually test it. Now, the other aspect of this is that when it comes to physical security, you have to get people involved. So I've said this a lot, but when it comes to physical security, there's a thing called front-heavy security. Front-heavy security has 2 parts. The first is that all the security tends to be around the perimeter of the building, usually at checkpoints, front door, rear door, whatever. That's where all the security is. And the second is any person who has gotten beyond those choke points or around that or beyond that perimeter, well, every person assumes you must be authorized to be here because how else did you get here, right? Well, that's a huge problem, because if that's the assumption that every person is making, that any person who's breached the perimeter is authorized to be here, well, you're screwed, because now, like, all I have to do is ever get past that perimeter and I'm in. It's what is that kid's game where you have like safe spaces, like you run and you like it's kind of like tag with like a
tag.
Yeah, like where
home base.
Yeah,
right?
like exactly.
Okay.
It's that kind of idea. It's like as long as I get there, I'm safe. Well, that's an idiotic thing to do, and this is why I encourage every company to, adopt like the CAT program, which is just this catch, award, and try again program, where every month or every quarter you have somebody walk through the building who's not supposed to be there, and the employee who stops them in a professional way gets a few days of paid holiday, right? So that costs you nothing, that doesn't require anything, and as long as you do it often enough, the employees will think, oh, maybe this is that game, right? If it happens once a year, they're going to forget it's a thing. But as long as it happens often enough, they're going to always be scanning. They're always going to be looking because they all want to not work. They all want paid vacation. Everybody does. That's the one thing that every person on every continent wants is either a lot of money or paid vacation at jobs. Like that's what they want. So if you can give that to them and you can convince them that this opportunity happens often enough that somebody that is not supposed to be here is wandering through the building and you're the guy who stops them, you get 2, 3, 4, 5 days of paid vacation, then poof, every person is scanning and looking and questioning and calling security and doing these kinds of things. And your security just went through the roof, at least during daylight hours.
In a way, that's kind of like a asymmetric defense.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, it requires, as long as you instigate this policy, it requires almost no effort on your part, and it has maximum effect. So yeah, it is kind of like an asymmetric defensive tool. But having done this job for 18 years-ish, it's shocking to me how many companies have never heard of it, don't implement it, or don't want to implement it. And it's like, but why? I'm not selling you a product. I'm not like, this isn't me saying like, oh, you should buy my No. I'm just telling you, implement this product, implement this thing, implement this concept. You can decide how often to do it. You can decide what reward to give, but empower your employees and give them like incentive to actually care about security because it's not their job. They don't care. And to be perfectly honest, it might be fun for them if the building got broken into. It might be a fun story. Oh, did you know that somebody broke in last night and stole this thing? Like, as long as they still have a job, as long as they're still getting paid, they don't care. I know that you think Sally who works for you or Bob who works down the hall like loves your company. They don't. They don't care. It's as long as they're getting a paycheck and as long as, things are going the way they should, they don't care. You have to encourage them to actually care. And doing the negative thing of saying like, oh, we're going to have somebody walk through the building and if you don't stop them, you get fired. That's a terrible way of doing it. Terrible for morale, terrible for the employees, but rewarding them by saying if you stop the guy professionally or call security on them, you get a few days of vacation. They love you for it. It boosts morale. It's a game. And it costs you nothing.
Sure. And, I'd like to circle back to something we were talking about earlier in terms of companies that limit your scope to the point that you can't actually execute asymmetrical attacks. That's kind of like a handicap to your ability to do your job. But there would also be like other handicaps, like we talked about. Your skill level could be a potential handicap to an asymmetrical attack. Yep. Maybe prohibited gear could be another one, like you can't take lockpicks in Poland or something like that. When you can't actually do a certain attack, like for any of those reasons, how do you report on that, and how do you sort of secure your client against those attacks when you were not able to execute on them for whatever reason?
Okay, so this is a really good question. And when you're running offensive work, you want to report on everything you discovered, even if it wasn't actioned upon. So I'll give you an example. Let's suppose for a minute that you're operating in a country where lockpicks are illegal. Okay, they exist. These countries they exist. Let's suppose that you're operating an engagement where lockpicks are outright illegal. Okay, but let's suppose that you found that there's an exposed server room and you can't bypass the door. Okay, they've got a really good underdoor security. They've got you can't slip the latch. They've got all this other stuff, but you could pick the lock if you were allowed to, if you had the tools. So, and let's say that door goes straight to the server room or the crown jewels or whatever, and it's accessible from the outside, and the only thing stopping you is a pin tumbler lock. Fine. But because you aren't allowed, either from scope or from law or from whatever else, to actually pick the lock, it's still a vulnerability. And you noticed it's a vulnerability. So what I encourage everyone to do when they're running an engagement is you report on every vulnerability you discovered, even if you didn't action upon it. So usually it goes like this. Now, that's an extreme example, but it does happen. But let's suppose during the recon, somebody hires you, and during the recon phase, you discover 10 likely vulnerabilities. 10 likely ways that you can get into the building. Okay. And let's say that the client contact has said, our biggest thing here, the biggest goal we want you to do is get to the server room, bug the corporate boardroom, bug the CFO's desk, just for a laugh, whatever. But we're trying to scare the board of directors into giving us a bigger budget, so you absolutely can't get caught. That's a deal breaker. You can't get caught. Okay, so of the 10 possible ways of getting in, you've limited it to 4 that have a high chance of being asymmetrical, right? They, very little risk to you, very little effort, and maximum chance of getting in and doing your thing. The rest of them are higher risk, right? Let's say, for example, one of them is literally just walking in through the front door during daylight hours, waving at the secretary and hoping she lets you through, right? Okay, maybe that works. It's really dumb and it's really loud in the sense of like, that you're like just, it's not loud in the sense of like audible loud, but it's loud in the sense like you could easily get caught. So you don't do those, given the constraints, you don't even approach or do those, but they are possible. So in the report, what I usually do is I start the reports with the standard stuff that you would do with any consultancy, where you outline the what the test was, when it was, who the client was, the basic stuff, the executive summaries, this kind of stuff. Then what I do is I list off the attack narratives. The attack narrative is, okay, well, we did this, here's how, and we just kind of walk through this. All the individual vulnerabilities I put at the very end in basically an appendix, and I reference them. But the attack narratives, I start off with the ones that I actually did, and the ones that were either the most shocking, the ones that were the most effective, the ones that were the most glaring in their like lack of security. But I also include the ones that I say, we didn't do this, but here's what here's why we didn't do this. Maybe it was time constraints, maybe it was, we weren't allowed, maybe we didn't have, whatever. But then you say, well, we didn't do this, but here is likely a vulnerability that would have worked, and here's why we think it would work. And then
here's how we would defend against it.
Yeah, of course. And every vulnerability, every attack narrative, every all these things, you have remediations. Like, what do you do to fix it? But the point is that even on the things that you couldn't or didn't test, you should, in my opinion, you should still include them in the report, especially on physical stuff, because they're likely still a vulnerability. Now, that said, one thing that you do have to keep in mind when it comes to asymmetries, like I kind of joked about, like, well, what happens if you just walk up to the secretary, you walk past her smiling and waving, and she just buzzes you through, right? It's possible. It might work, but there's an aspect of that type of attack vector that isn't really fair to either the client or to you as a pen tester, and that's luck. Maybe she's having a really good day and she's feeling extra friendly, and that's the day you happen to try that attack. Or maybe she's really upset that day, and normally she would let you in, but she's just really, on edge that day, and so she decided not to. So luck always plays a factor in this. And so you have to take that into account. And when you're planning out what is a viable asymmetric attack, you have to think about that. Like, okay, but what if, right?
Sure. And one of the points that you've made previously that really sticks in my head is the bad guy is always going to win eventually. So how can you ever beef up your physical security so it's more of a fair fight?
Right. So, okay. So first off, do the CAT program. Because if you're a location or a business or an establishment with personnel, now this doesn't work for a remote pumping station. This doesn't work for an offshore oil rig that's unmanned, or an offshore substation that's unmanned most of the time. This doesn't work for all places. But if you're an establishment, a business or whatever that has employees on site, get them engaged. Do the CAT program, right? Highly encouraged. That's basically the equivalent of asymmetric defense. Second, hire somebody who's on the offensive security space to give you a reality check every once in a while. Because look, again, it's like playing a game of basketball without like you said, like never shooting a hoop, like ever. You're just doing the defensive drills. It's like, okay, well then you have no idea when the time comes to shoot a basket if you're actually going to do it well. You just don't know because
you're probably not if you've never shot one before.
No, exactly. You probably won't, and that's the point. Is like you might have the best defense in the world, but that's not the ultimate goal. And you have to practice. You have to do these reality checks. But at the same time, keep in mind that security comes in three parts, right? Compliance, defense, and offense. And if you are lacking in any of them, you don't really have good security, right? Because think about it, realistically, if I took any of those three away and said, well, we don't really see the value of the compliance stuff. Okay, well, then you probably have a whole litany of stuff you're doing wrong, right?
Sure.
This is where you get into companies who say stupid things like, we've invented our own way of doing crypto. We've invented our own way of, securing our digital systems or something. We're not using RSA. We're not using, any type of known cryptographic system. We've invented our own. Chances are that won't go well. Chances are you've made a mistake and you don't know what that is. So it's having compliance. It's a good way of saying, look, this is the industry standard. Let's use the industry standard, right? If you say like, well, we're making a new airplane. Are you using any of the tried and true methods? Nope, we're doing it all on our own. We're starting from scratch. It's like, well, okay, you're probably going to make a lot of mistakes.
Sure.
So it's really hard to take away from any of those one things and do it well. They have to work together.
Yeah.
And it's not, the thing is that you, at the bare minimum, start having conversations with people. Maybe you can't afford a full-on, black team engagement. That's fine. You don't need one. Most companies don't need an engagement right off the bat. But at a bare minimum, get an audit, which will be, significantly cheaper, or just have a conversation, have a consultation with somebody. Even if you just pay an offensive guy to come in and just spend a few hours talking to you about your situation and what you have, and they can give you ideas, that alone could actually offer you a litany of insights that you might not have considered. I've gone on many consultation things before where all they have me do is just walk around and be like, all right, do you notice we're going to walk around the building for a few hours? Could you just tell us? You don't have to write a report. Just let us know what you think might be vulnerable, and then work with us to try and fix them. Work with us to try and remediate them. Something. It's like, it doesn't have to break the bank. But if you don't include those 3 pillars of security, there's a very, very good chance you're screwing something up. And I had somebody once who gave me some pushback, and they said, well, we don't look at physical security threats as a viable threat. And I brought up to them, I said, look, so let's take just the energy sector. Let's take the substation thing. You are looking at this and saying it's not a viable attack because it doesn't happen. Well, the Department of Energy says it happens almost 200 times a year, which means that quite literally every other day somebody is attempting to take down the power grid, or local or national. But that aside, let's say that doesn't happen in your country. What you're really saying is, we are aware that if one person with a rifle who knows what they're doing could take down our entire power grid to our country, or at least to a city, and a dozen people who know what they're doing, who are coordinated, could potentially take out power to the entire country. And we're aware of this, and we're aware of how easy and vulnerable we are, but we're not going to do anything about it because we don't think it's probable. That is your security model. Your security model comes down to the fact that, look, we are aware of how vulnerable we really are and how easy it would be to exploit us, but we don't think it's likely. And keep in mind, we're not talking about somebody who, we're not talking about an attack vector where somebody says, okay, well, me and my 12 buddies are going to go to Eglin Air Force Base and we're going to steal a B-2 that has a loaded, JDAM bomb on it. No. You're not talking about something extreme like that. You're talking about just some person who can get a rifle or get a gun, and they know what they're doing, they can coordinate, and they can do something really terrible. And that's what you're talking about. And it's not a hard thing. It's an asymmetric attack. And your security model has become, yeah, but we don't think it's likely.
Yeah, and by that same logic, a company could easily say, oh, well, our chances of ever, having ransomware or anything like that happen to us are very, very low, so we're not going to do anything about it.
Effectively, yes. The entire thing of why ransomware is now so understood is because it went from kind of 30 years ago, it went from kind of like a niche thing of this doesn't really happen, to now it's so common, it's such a common attack vector that I don't think that there's a legitimate company alive that doesn't know what it is and doesn't have some protocol in place of what do we do if this happens? Every company seems to have some type of backup plan, right? It's well, okay, but that's the whole point. You understand the risk. But again, go back to the United States. Department of Energy. This happens about 180 times a year. That's not a rare occurrence. And the reason why it doesn't happen more in other places is not because it's not viable. It's because, luckily, people aren't as aware of it, and there isn't really as much of a need to do it. What I mean by need to do it is, it's not... let me say it this way. It makes sense why people would steal water. It makes sense why somebody would take a substation out, an adversary would take a substation out at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. But with the world the way that it's going, you're getting into a more and more adversarial global situation. And if another country is aware that your entire infrastructure is so childishly vulnerable to basic asymmetric attacks, it's not beyond feasible that they're going to take advantage of it. And again, your security model is, we know that that's possible. We just don't think it's likely.
A chain link fence and a prayer.
Well, yeah, like that's, I mean, look up Google, for everybody listening to this, Google substation, and what you will likely see on every image, or most of them, is a bunch of transformers sitting out in the middle of nowhere guarded by a chain link fence. That's your security. That's the entirety of it. And I mean, it's not just power. It's all aspects. We could go into, a whole litany of critical infrastructure that is just as vulnerable. But you start realizing, just how vulnerable things are. Take the Russian-Ukraine war is a perfect example of new asymmetric attacks. 5-10 years ago, I would never have said drones are make for asymmetric attacks, because it's more of a nuisance, right? Like, okay, a drone could be a nuisance, sure. You might be able to take a plane down with a drone, sure, maybe, if you know what you're doing. But now, with the Ukraine war and drone technology taking off the way that it has, you can spend about roughly $10,000 to $30,000 for a drone that has a maximum range of about 750 kilometers and can carry a fairly large explosive payload. Okay, well, you can see within both Ukraine and in Russia power plants that are completely destroyed by one or two drones. Okay, well, think about that. Your adversary is 750 kilometers away from you.
And they spent 20 grand
to take down a multi-billion-dollar power plant. And how are you going to catch them? What is the risk to them? They're 700 kilometers away from the target. And yes, they might have spent $10,000 or $30,000, but again, $10,000 or $30,000 is not the same as $2 billion power plant. And yes, you can't destroy the entire power plant, but you could cripple parts of it that have to be repaired before the thing can be brought online. So that's the whole point, right? It's 10 years ago, I would never have said, oh yeah, drone technology is such a threat, but it is today. It just is. So yeah, this is the asymmetry of it, right? That's what you're looking for when you're talking about asymmetric attacks. Minimal risk, minimal effort for maximum effectiveness. And they exist all over the place in all fields.
Is there anything else that you think we should discuss in terms of asymmetrical attacks that we haven't touched on already?
I think that asymmetric attacks is a perfect example of why it's important to bring in offensive security minds to the security game. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to think like my former CISO student who just said, well, in order to secure this room, what lock would you recommend that will keep it perfectly secure? They don't exist. It doesn't exist. And so, but if you have that mindset, whether it's my former student, whether it's the Secret Service, whether it's whomever, that just, how do we secure things? More guys at the guards, bigger fences, more cameras,
better locks.
It's like, if that's your idea of how to increase security, you're going to fail. You're going to fail because somebody's going to come across with novel ideas and they're going to exploit things you didn't think about.
So hire people who think novelly.